AlJazeera that had seen uprisings in the past on a small scale, it has to be said, and we were looking for something to happen there. But the rest of the city tightly shut up, shops closed, very little traffic on the road. And when the events took place, they were in fact small scale. But let me put you together with someone who was actually there physically, who has more freedom of movement than I do and more ability to move through the city than I currently have. Peter Beaumont from the Guardian newspaper has been here for the last few days, and he was himself in Tajuma.
No, we went to Souk Juma. We tried to get into AlJazeera, but it was completely ringed with tanks and checkpoints. In fact, we ran into about 3 checkpoints, I guess, in the space of about 15 minutes. In Souk Juma, there was a tremendous presence of police, and when people did come out of the mosques, there was just no possibility for them to demonstrate at all. And in fact, we saw some young men outside one mosque. And actually, when we went to try and talk to them, some of them went away. But the one guy who didn't go away, as we approached him, we had 8 cars descend on us. We were allowed to carry on with our business, but he was instantly arrested.
Talk numbers to me, Peter, for a moment. I mean, how big were the protests, and how big was the security forces that moved in to surround them and isolate them?
Well, there were no protests at all in the first place we went to. We spoke to colleagues who were in AlJazeera. There were hundreds there, but they were very quickly broken up when they came out of the mosque with tear gas. On junctions, we would see sometimes 4 tanks pointing in every single direction. There must have been hundreds of soldiers out there and dozens of tanks.
Now, I also understand you've been in touch with people in Zawiya. We've been getting very conflicting information from there. Libyan government sources claiming that Zawiya has fallen, or been retaken by government forces, but also that pockets of fighting remain. Now, what are you hearing?
I spoke to someone I met in Zawiya on Sunday when I went into the town, and he confirms there's been fighting since 10 o'clock this morning when militia forces came in from the west. He says, and I believe the government now confirms this, that there is still resistance in the town. He says that the fighting has come within about 1 kilometre of Martha Square in the centre, but that's as close as it's been. And I mean, the claims of death between 10 and 50, who can tell?
That's what we're hearing too. And again, the numbers of fighters you think were able to fight out of Zawiya, give us an idea of how large the resistance force, the rebel force was.
With arms, probably a couple of hundred.
Peter Beaumont of The Guardian, thank you very, very much indeed. Well, as you can see there, Lauren, a lot happening, but it's really important to emphasize the resistance movement, as it is in Libya, is incredibly scattered. They are pockets. They are not widespread, certainly in this part of the country.
OK, Anita, thank you very much indeed for bringing us the very latest there from Tripoli. Well, meanwhile, the humanitarian crisis caused by the conflict is worsening. 180,000 people have fled the country, and thousands more, especially from the Indian subcontinent, are still waiting. The UN says more than 90,000 have fled to Tunisia, nearly 80,000 have crossed into Egypt, and another 2,500 people have crossed at the Niger border too. But while agencies are warning of a growing crisis for these refugees, thousands more are still stuck inside Libya. Bernard Smith reports.
Row after row of tents in this UN transit camp on the Tunisian side of the border with Libya. The site is already full. But the process of moving these people home has picked up. Throughout Friday, 40 flights will head to Cairo alone. Britain, France and the United States are providing aircraft to help the evacuation. The UN says that the number of refugees crossing into Tunisia has actually dropped significantly because the border there is now manned by heavily armed pro-Gaddafi forces. So almost all of Libya's neighbours could end up dealing with fleeing workers. Some have now fled through Algeria, further down Libya's western frontier. And up to 100,000 people may try to cross into Niger in the coming months. That's according to the UN. At Egypt's frontier with Libya, hundreds of African refugees are stranded in a border no man's land. Some have been there for days. Here, the Egyptian authorities have tightened security, fearing that mercenaries hired by Gaddafi may try to flee to Egypt. Bernard Smith, Al Jazeera.
Egypt's new Prime Minister has been welcomed as a guest of honour amongst protesters in Cairo's Tahrir Square. Essam Sharaf urged the demonstrators to cooperate and play their part in, quote, rebuilding the country. Raoya Rage was out amongst the crowds in Cairo and sent us this report.
Crushed in a sea of humanity, Egypt's new Prime Minister arrives in Tahrir Square. A scene so momentous in this country, many could not believe it was actually happening. An official of such ranking in a rally that large, that exposed. We love you, the crowd chanted.
I'm here because I get my legitimacy from you. I will exert all my efforts to respond to your demands, and if I fail, I will join you.
As the crowd demanded the ouster of all of the previous regime's men, the Prime Minister urged patience and called on protesters to help him rebuild Egypt. Assam Sharaf's appointment is being celebrated as yet another victory of people power. For weeks, protesters had called for his Mubarak-appointed predecessor to go. But there are still other demands.
The emphasis of these protesters now is mainly state security, the Ministry of Interior's most feared arm. They would like to see that apparatus completely dissolved and those who issued the orders to fire on protesters during the uprising held accountable.
Releasing all political prisoners is yet another pressing issue. On Thursday, authorities released 2 sentenced leaders of the previously outlawed Muslim Brotherhood group. Showing up in Tahrir, they thanked the military but asked for more.
We were released on medical grounds, but we want the verdicts completely dropped. We also want back our businesses that were shut down and confiscated. We want our stolen rights back.
Similar demands echoed by many, including this man, who asked the new government to restore the wealth squandered by the old. Calls for a better life in a new country. Raoya Rage, AlJazeera, Cairo.
There's been further unrest on the streets of Bahrain. Thousands of anti-government demonstrators have marched on the information ministry in the town of Issa, where they surrounded the state television headquarters. It follows clashes between Sunni and Shia groups on Thursday night, during which several people were injured. More protests have erupted in the wealthy Gulf Sultanate of Oman. Demonstrators have converged on the second biggest city, Sohar, to demand political reform, higher wages and an end to corruption. Our special correspondent is there and sent us this report. For his own safety, we're not naming him.
Friday prayer in Oman's second largest city of Sohar, and more than 2,000 protesters turned the main traffic intersection into a place of worship. The anti-government sentiment here in Oman differs from the rest of the region's turmoil in 2 key ways. There's been much less violence and much more love for their leader.
We are making this to support the Sultan, not to face the Sultan. This is another thing. We are just facing the corruption here.
Sultan Qaboos